Hello, welcome to Lecture 2, Machinery in the Costume Shop. So we use a fair amount of machinery in the costume shop. The most common one that you probably imagine that we use the most often, which we do, is the sewing machine. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sewing machine, a little bit about how it works, a little bit about the history. So sewing machines that we use today, they're lock stitch sewing machines. So lock stitch machine means that there is a needle and thread on the top, and then there's a bobbin with thread, a bobbin or shuttle with thread on the bottom. So you've got two threads going at the same time. So those threads kind of loop together and lock, and that creates a nice secure stitch. So that's what we use today. The earliest sewing machines were single thread chain stitch machines. And these machines, like I said, they've got one thread, and the way it works is it kind of loops itself together. And it is pretty good, it is pretty sturdy, but if you pull the wrong way, the whole thing will come undone. So they're not exactly what we want to use today because it's not as secure of a stitch. Now the first sewing machine that was patented in 1790 by Thomas Saint. And it was a single stitch machine that was made for working on leather. And it didn't work very well, but we kept plugging away. And in 1830, we had our next patented sewing machine by Bartholomew, let me spell this right, Temanier. Yes. And this machine was made for making officers' uniforms. There's actually many innovations and inventions that have happened in the world because of war and because of military innovation, and the clothing industry is no different. Like I said, one of our earliest machines was patented to make officers' uniforms. Well, not just officers, but make military uniforms, because you need a lot of them and you need to make them very quickly. That also is where we get ready to wear sizing, because that was the first kind of industry where they wanted to have a lot of things on hand that you just pick a size and give it to an individual. So there's a number of innovations that came out of that. One of those is the sewing machine. Now our next innovation after this is our first lock stitch machine, and that was patented in 1846 by Elias Howe. So we often think of Isaac Singer as the inventor of the sewing machine, but the inventor of the lock stitch sewing machine was actually Elias Howe. However, our next, and this machine was a hand crank machine. So what you would do is, as you're sewing, you're putting the material through the machine with one hand, but you're actually turning a crank to operate it with the other. So what Singer did in 1851, so very quickly after this, Singer invented the treadle sewing machine. So instead of operating the machine with a hand crank to the side, there's actually a treadle, there's a pedal at the bottom, and you manually move that pedal up and down with your foot. So that gives you both hands free for doing your sewing, and it helps you control the speed because you're kind of doing that with your foot. Now, one of the main reasons why we probably think of Singer as the inventor of the sewing machine is because Singer is the one who made the first motorized sewing machine, and that was in 1889. And of course, once we get that motorized machine, everything just kind of takes off and gets faster. Elias Howe helped. One of the other things that helped with the development of this machine is he made it, helped make it in a way that made it very easy to do assembly line construction of the machine itself, which helped to make us able to produce more faster and at a lower cost. So it was one of the first reasonably priced machines, so it became easier for households to attain. And that trend kind of keeps going as we develop machines more and more. So that's a little bit of kind of about the development and the history of the sewing machine. We've got industrial sewing machines, and we have what we call domestic sewing machines. Industrial machines are heavier duty. They go much faster. They can handle much heavier fabrics, but they tend to be much more limited in the types of stitches they can do. For instance, you're usually going to have a straight stitch machine or a zigzag machine. Every once in a while, you'll find an industrial machine that will do both, but usually they're one stitch. You're not going to be able to do a buttonhole or any decorative stitching on an industrial machine. They're just really heavy duty, kind of singular purpose machines. They're great for doing things like draperies or tarps or backdrop if you have to sew backdrops for production. It's industrial kind of seat covers, so things like that is what those industrial machines are good for. So they're good to have available to you. Then there's domestic machines, and domestic machines basically means it's made for household use. So these machines tend to be smaller, they tend to be more lighter weight, and they tend to be something that's, especially nowadays, that's somewhat portable. Because oftentimes you're either going to have this machine stored and then you bring it out when you need to use it in the house as opposed to having it always out. You might take it to a class, you might take it to a friend's house and have a sewing bee, which is actually kind of fun. I've done that a few times with friends in the past. And so these machines, they also can do things like buttonholes. You can get a machine that just does buttonholes. Of course, they're going to do really beautiful ones. But they also might do some decorative stitches. You can get home and domestic machines that will do embroidery. Again, you also have industrial embroidery machines. You can get industrial quilting machines, but you can also do quilting on domestic machines. So you can do about the same thing on both of them, but the domestic machine, smaller, easier to use, it's not as fast, and they tend to be more versatile as far as being able to do a number of different functions and stitches. With any machine, well, and another thing about the domestic machines and even industrial, there's mechanical, what we call mechanical machines, and digitized machines. So much like cars, we can kind of compare them to cars a little bit. You've got, your older cars are fully mechanical, but as computers advance, we've got more of that computer technology being used in these machines. So the computerized technology allows you to have even more decorative stitches, more options. In some ways, you can have some finer control over some of your settings. And it's just a little bit easier, and it can make them a little more lightweight because you don't have to have some of the internal workings for the decorative stitches and things like that. So those are getting more and more popular, again, like they are in cars. Cars, there's so much, if they break down, sometimes you can't override what that is because it's something that's happened in the computer that's shutting things down. So the manual part is a little more difficult to access. We like to have the mechanical machines as opposed to digital machines in the costume shop. That's been the trend for a long time, but that is shifting partially because the industry is shifting. It's getting harder and harder to find fully mechanical machines. So a lot of times you'll see these mechanical machines, but more and more we're going to see the computerized machines coming out. You want to get those serviced. The more often you use it, the more you're going to want to service it. Again, like your car, you get your oil change every 3,000 miles. Well, it depends. Mine is now 6,000, which is very strange to me. But every certain amount of miles, you get your oil changed. And, if you drive more, that's going to happen more often. With the sewing machine, if you sew with it very frequently, you're going to get it serviced more often. Generally, if you sew on a very regular basis, like more than once a month, then you're going to want to get that serviced every year. If you just sew a few times a year, just minor repairs and things, you might want to get it serviced every 2 or 3 years. If you use it every 2 or 3 years, then you might get it serviced much farther apart than that. Or it might have collected so much dust that you need to service it before you use it each time. So anyway, you want to keep that maintenance up, because when you keep that maintenance up, then it's less likely to break down. So it can save you time and hassle and headache, as well as money in the long run. Now, when a sewing machine is serviced, what they're going to do is they're going to go out and they're going to clean out lint, because working with thread and fabrics, you're going to generate lint, and that often gets caught into the machine. You're going to need those gears oiled. You're going to need the belts checked, and you're going to need the timing checked. So, like I said, most of our modern machines, not most, all of them are lock stitch machines. And so you've got your needle coming down from the top, and then you've got your bobbin or your shuttle running underneath. And you want to make sure the timing is correct so that when the needle goes down, the bobbin turns at the right rate so that the loop is created to make your lock stitch. And once that happens, then everything's fine. Now, if the timing is off, then either that loop could not catch, or even worse, if your needle goes down at the wrong time, it might hit the bobbin and jam the machine up, and that's going to be quite costly. So you want to keep that upkeep. The timing is really the thing that you want to work on and think about the most. So that's a little bit about sewing machines, keeping them up. If we talk about types of sewing machines, as far as domestic machines are, there's kind of three kind of top tier higher end machines that you're going to see most often in costume shops. There's going to be Viking, Pfaff, and most often you're going to see Bernina. Bernina has consistently had it's usually the Bernina 1008, to be honest. But Bernina's kind of been producing a good price point, all metal, all mechanical machine for a very long time. They're phasing that out finally. So we're really going to have to shift into that computerized arena. Viking, these are made in Viking and Pfaff, I think. Pfaff was German, but I think actually Viking may have bought it. So these, I believe, are made in Sweden. The Bernina is Swiss. And they have all metal gears. So they're going to last for a good long time. Some of them are self-oiling. Like I said, Bernina is pretty much very popular with the industry. I prefer the Viking. Pfaffs are usually used by quilters a great deal. Viking is also known as Husqvarna Viking, and actually they also make tools and tractors and things. So you may see their logo there a little bit more than you might see on some sewing machines. But these are kind of our top three. The lower end price points are probably going to run about $700, $800, $900. So even if you're investing in one of their kind of lower end baser models, it's still a bit of an investment. And like I said, that's because they are all metal gears and they have a good long life in them. You're also going to see Brother. Brother has gotten very popular. They've also been they've stepped up their quality in the last few years. So Brother machines tend to be good. They have a much wider range. You're going to have your smaller lower end machines that are going to be around 200 or so, but they will get all the way up into industrial machines, quilting, embroidery, etc. So they've got a nice broad range of machines. And they tend to be pretty good, pretty sturdy. You can still purchase Singer sewing machines today. Anything made by Singer after about the 1970s, that's when the quality started kind of going down in those. So any older Singers are a really good investment. But the newer Singers, Singer no longer manufactures their own machines. They now will license their name to other developers and people that make machines. So when you buy a Singer, it's not a Singer sewing machine. You're just paying for the brand name that's on that machine. That doesn't mean that they are all bad, but the older ones are better quality. But you can, as long as you take care of your machine, almost any machine you get is probably going to do what you need it to do as far as domestic sewing. But again, just take good care of it and it'll do what you need. Okay. So one of the other machines I want to talk about is a machine called a serger. So a serger is something that you can use to finish the edge of your machines. Okay, you're not going to finish the edge of your machines. To finish the edge of your seams within your garment. The seam is where you sew two pieces of fabric together to join them in making the garment. Now a serger, our sewing machine uses 2 threads. A serger is going to use 3, 4, or 5 threads. Okay, and a serger is also often called an overcaster, or sometimes it's called overcasting or overcaster. Sometimes it's called a marrow. a marrow machine, or it might be called marrowing, because one of the early sergers was, the brand name was Marrow. So I still run into costumers who've been sewing for a long time who call it marrowing and overcasting. So what happens with a serger is it actually trims the edge of your seam, and it finishes it off by wrapping that edge of that fabric in thread. So that keeps it from raveling or unraveling, which is this means the same thing, which is weird. So a 3-thread serger stitch, that's best for just finishing the edge. You can do a seam with that, but it's not as secure as a seam on a lock stitch machine. And what that's going to look like, and if you look at almost any article of clothing that you've bought, if you look inside at the seams, it's almost always going to be a serged edge. Either it was sewn and then the edge was finished on the serger, or it was sewn together on using a serger. So a 3-thread overcast. So you'll have your seam here. You have the edge of the fabric over here, your edge of your seam, and then the fabric is gonna loop over the edge of that fabric. So it's gonna look kind of like this, right? So that's what a 3-thread is. So you've got one thread here, you've got an upper looper where the thread's coming this way, lower looper where it's coming that way. A 4-thread is the best if you're going to actually sew the seam itself and not just finish the edge, because you've got your one seam and then you've also got a second seam here. So it's just a little bit stronger, a little bit better finish. And then here's the edge of your fabric, and of course your overcast, your thread is overcast over the edge. Now a 5-thread is a very specialized stitch. This is what you're going to see probably on the hem of your t-shirts. So if you look at the bottom of most likely a t-shirt, so you're looking at the bottom, so this is the hem, this is the finished edge that you see on the outside, right? And it's folded up inside, and you're going to see usually 2 rows of stitching on the top of the garment. Now when you flip that over and look from the other side, you're going to see thread kind of going back and forth. So this is the front, this is the back, you're going to see the thread like this on the back. So that's a cover stitch hem, and that's something you need a 5-thread serger to do. You can do something similar with something called a twin needle on a sewing machine, but it's not as flat and it's not as nice a finish as you'll get for a cover stitch on your serger. So sergers have become very important because it's a very quick, easy way to finish the edge of your garment. Before sergers, the ways that you could finish off the edge of a seam so it wouldn't ravel, there's a there's a French seam, which we're actually going to learn to do in class. So there's pinking. Pinking is something that you may have seen, and if you've done any scrapbooking, you're familiar with this. Pinking or pinking shears. They're specialized scissors or shears that cut kind of notches. So a pinked seam, you'll have the seam here, and then the seam allowance. The seam allowance is the area between the stitching line and the edge of the fabric. The seam allowance will have been cut into like little triangles. And that's one way to kind of keep it from raveling or unraveling. And you see that a lot in some of the older garments. And then the other is with bias tape. You can actually wrap the edge in a bias tape so it's finished off. So if you ever open an older garment and there's a piece of fabric over the edge of the seam, that's a bias tape seam. So those are some finishing things, but like I said, we tend to use the serger because it's much faster, it's much easier, and speed is very important when we're making costumes. It's got to be very sturdy, it's got to be built correctly, but it also needs to be usually built fairly quickly. So that's a little bit about sergers. You will have a part of your vest in the vest project that will need to be serged, and I'll give you guys a demonstration on that. And if you are able to come to campus to use the costume shop lab, then you'll use the serger on that step. If you don't have access to a serger and can't come in, then we'll work out an alternative, but you will have the opportunity to learn how to use the serger and experience that. I'm not sure if I mentioned there's a blade involved in this. So it trims the edge down for you as well as covering the edge. So that's part of the finishing. So that's just something to be mindful of and careful of when you're using that machine. So that's everything that we kind of need for construction. There's also a machine that you might see called a blind stitch machine, and that's for hemming, especially in menswear, men's trousers, or the skirts in women's suits. You don't see any thread on the outside to finish off that hem. It's just folded up and it's magically just lives there. And if you go inside, you may not see it either, because often the blind stitch machines will use what we call invisible thread, which is very thin, lightweight plastic thread. It's kind of like fishing line, but way, way lighter and finer. And that machine just does that blind hem. That's the only thing it'll do. So if you routinely are doing shows where you've got a lot of trousers and you have a lot of hems you have to do, it's a great machine to have on hand. But most domestic machines have a blind hem stitch. It's not as invisible as the blind hem machine, but we also can do blind hem by hand, and that's one of the stitches you'll learn in this class. So one of the next things that we'll use on a fairly regular basis are irons and steamers. And when we use an iron, we are always using a steam iron. As I have mentioned before, the steam does a whole lot more work in that iron than the heat does. Again, there's industrial and domestic irons. We tend to use, I prefer industrial irons when possible. Industrial irons tend to be heavier. They tend to have a larger separate water reservoir for the steam, so that you can have this access to the steam a lot longer because there's a lot more water that it has access to. And the weight of the iron, there's less work to do while you're pressing, because the weight will kind of press it into the garment, so you don't have to use as much arm strength. But then it can also get a little tiring when you're lifting the heavier object here and there. Sometimes we'll also use domestic irons, and there will always be a steam iron, like I said, and those are the ones that you fill directly into the iron itself. They're lighter weight, they're more portable. You might see those more in dressing rooms for wardrobe use, whereas the industrial irons you'll see more in the costume shop setting. So the other thing about the industrial irons is they very often do not have that safety cutoff, because you're usually going back and forth to iron fairly often throughout the process, but you may not be doing it so often that it doesn't cut off, and you don't want to wait for it to heat back up. So when using the industrial irons, you have to be much more conscientious of making sure that iron gets turned off at the end of the day, whereas many of the domestic irons have an automatic cutoff if it's not been used after a certain amount of time. Steamers it tends to have a reservoir tank, and then like a long hose, and then you've got like a little gun or a little paddle where the steam comes out. That's best for things like drapery or wedding gowns or cloaks, things that have a lot of long hanging yardage, so you don't have to deal with kind of getting all of that onto the ironing board or the ironing table. And also it just gravity's kind of helping you, and it's kind of laying in place the way that it needs to. So that's kind of when we might use a steamer. So those are a couple of other pieces of equipment that you might see in the costume shop. A specialized piece of equipment that, if you're really fortunate to have, is a dye vat. And I've talked about this a little bit, but I just want to talk a little bit more specifically about what that is. So in your craft area, very often we want to dye fabrics because the designer has created design that's has very specific color palette, and that works with the lights and that works with the set. So you want to get that color correct. It needs to be what the designer needs it to be. And if they can't find the fabric that they need in the store, they might find something similar that's the wrong color, and then you'll have to dye it. They might not be able to find what they need at all, so they'll just get a plain fabric, and then it's the costume craft area's job to modify that fabric into what it needs to be. We'll have a fabric modification project later on in the semester, and we'll talk about some of those specific techniques. But as far as dyeing, that's the most common fabric modification we do. We'll also sometimes dye things to distress them, to make them look older and more worn, or again, to achieve a certain color palette for the design. So a dye vat is a large industrial kind of like soup kettle. They can be 40, 60, or even 80 gallons. So they're big, heavy duty pieces of equipment. And what you'll have is a pot that's inside. It's encased inside a steam jacketed kind of box, right? So traditionally, when we think about heating a pot of water, that's on a stove. We've got the heating element underneath, and then the water is heated from below, and then the heat rises up to the top. So generally, you tend to have to stir that a lot because the heat is it's hotter at the bottom, and if something rests on the bottom, it's going to have a different heat than what's happening at the top. If you get this kind of steam jacketed box here, then you've got hot steam that's circling the pot the entire time from top to bottom. So you're getting consistent heat from top to bottom. So that way, whatever's at the top and whatever's at the bottom is getting that same heat. And when you're dyeing fabrics, there are some cold water dyes, but generally it's the heat that activates the dye in the water that makes it work, that makes it adhere to the fibers. So you want that heat to be evenly distributed. You also want to have a nice large area to work in, because the more you can kind of keep that fabric moving, the more even your dye job is going to be, and the more complete and better result you're going to get. So that's one of the things that makes these very desirable. But there's a lot more considerations with a dye vat. It's not a pot you can pick up and dump out. This is something that has to be installed in place. You're going to have a floor drain in order to empty that out, because like I said, you can't pick it up and dump it. You're going to have some type of water source that will reach into it, because you can't take it to the water source. The water source will have to come to it. And it's usually a 220 volt electricity, so you have to have that additional consideration. So, and these can cost $10,000 to $15,000, which is why you don't see them in a lot of shops unless it is a very professional shop with its own kind of craft area. So these are ideal, and so it's a very valuable piece of equipment if you're fortunate to have it in your shop. A couple of other little things I want to mention. They're a little more tools. They're not machinery as much, but you might get mechanized ones. So we'll use shears. You can actually get electric shears that kind of move themselves. I mean, you have to direct them, but they'll move up and down by themselves. It's really good if you've got, once you learn how to control those, if you have to do a lot of cutting in one day, it reduces your hand fatigue. You also might have hot melt glue guns. You might see those more in the craft area than the sewing area. It's not a tool that I use a great deal, because it's much harder to alter something that's been glued together than sewn together. But sometimes you're in a position where that's the right tool for the job, and that's when you use it. We also will often use electric knives. You may have seen these at Thanksgiving to help carve turkeys, but they're really great for cutting through thick, like upholstery foam, when we're doing crafting work and such. I want to backtrack a little bit and talk about both with sergers and with the sewing machines. You need sewing needles for both of those. A lot of domestic machines use the same kind of needle, but different machines may use different needles, so you're going to have to refer to that machine's owner's manual to make sure you get the right one for it. You also need to figure out what material you're working with. So sewing machine needles come in various sizes. You have very lightweight, fine ones for finer fabrics. You've got heavy-duty ones for things like denim and canvas that are much heavier fabrics. So you want to make sure you're not using a lightweight fabric on a lightweight needle on a heavy fabric, because then your needle's going to break, and then you've got to start all over, and you hope that the broken needle's not inside the machine, things like that. So use the right needle for the job. And there's also specialty needles, such as ballpoint needles, that they're kind of blunted on the tip, that are good for knit fabrics. So that way the needle kind of pushes the fibers aside as opposed to piercing through them like a regular needle. On the flip side of that, for leather, you've got a special needle that actually has a blade on it, because leather doesn't have fibers. In order to sew through it, you have to create the hole, and that needle has like a little 3-bladed edge to create that actual into a hole for sewing. So you're going to have to look at things like that. So what type what type needle does your machine need, and what style of that needle do you need for the fabric that you're doing and the project you're working on? And I just want there's a little bit different. When we think of sewing needles, we mostly think of a hand sewing needle, which is pretty much like this. It comes down to a point. You've got your eye up here to put your thread through, correct? Now, a sewing machine needle is different because you've got a shaft up here that's either fully rounded or sometimes they're flat on the back. And then your needle is down here, and it comes to a point down here. And the eye for the thread is down at the point. So the sewing machine needles, they're very distinctive from a hand needle. You'll know very quickly if it's for sewing machine or hand needling. You can't sew by hand with one of these, and you can't put one of these into the sewing machine. So you want to make sure you have the right one for what you need. So that's just a general overview of some of the equipment that we use in the costume shop, some of the machinery. We'll talk a little bit later about some of our more specific tools and go over how those are used and what we need those for. But thank you very much for joining me for lecture number 2.